this afternoon?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. Do you mind giving us a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Matt Clifford. The vast majority of my time goes on being co-founder and CEO of a company called Entrepreneur First. And what we do at Entrepreneur First is we try to increase the supply of great entrepreneurs globally. We do that by backing individuals who we think will be great founders before they have a company and helping them find a co-founder and build a business from scratch. So I've been doing that for actually about a decade now, which is probably a lot longer than I thought I was going to be doing it a decade ago. But I've ended up very, very convinced that it's actually a really important mission and that the world needs more entrepreneurs. So that sort of provides a good bridge into like the big ideas I'm interested in. I'm very interested in the broad idea of talent and what people with exceptional talent can and should do to maximize the impact they have in the world, whatever kind of impact they're interested in. I'm interested in that from a kind of business and value creation point of view. I'm interested from a sort of altruistic point of view. But I think this idea of like, do we as a species allocate talent well overall is a really important question and probably still underexplored. So that's one big thing. And then I guess the other side of what I do at EF is obviously one side is talent and the other side is technology. And so I'm very, very interested in the question of, are we doing enough to survive and thrive as a species in terms of making the sorts of scientific and technological breakthroughs that I think are going to be required if the answer to that question is to be yes. And so I'm very interested in how do we design institutions that encourage the right sorts of incentives for scientists and technologists, and how do we ensure that as a society, again as a species, we're allocating capital and talent in the right ways on that. So that's probably the second big thing. And then the final thing I'd say is I'm sort of interested in how those two questions tie together into a set of, I suppose, more political questions about what are the set of values that we would want to, if you like, embed in those processes of both like the institutions that we build and the technologies that we build. And, if you believe, as I do, that actually there are some sets of values that we would want to survive for a very long time and some that we would not want to be trapped in for a very long time, then I think the question of like, how do we design these institutions and processes to give the values we care about the best chance of surviving and thriving is also really important.
That's great. That's great. Well, I want to hit on all those points. How would you grade humanity right now on how we're doing on these fronts? You recently had a tweet, which I really enjoyed, which was, we were promised flying cars, but all we got were 90% effective vaccines within 10 months and a novel pandemic with a new technology. It's pretty awesome. Do you think we're like kind of beginning to escape the great stagnation? Where are we on those fronts and how are we doing as a species?
I don't think it's inevitable that we escape the great stagnation. I think there are, unfortunately, I think there are a lot of institutional challenges throughout. I hate to use like nebulous and loaded terms like the West, but I think it probably is the best shorthand for what I mean. I think, well, do we have the talent and the sort of skill to be able to create things like, mRNA vaccines for a novel pandemic? Yeah, I mean, that should be a very encouraging sign. But I kind of find the worrying thing about that story is that it took a very legible, like extreme global manifested risk to emerge in order for us to do that. And no sooner had we done that than we got back to business as usual. And I think you see all around you the signs that we're, going to make a bunch of mistakes that exacerbate, like the set of things that probably led us to the pandemic, rather than compounding the gains of, being that we saw in things like the development of those vaccines. So, I think the thing I feel very optimistic about is that, I'm a very big believer in our species. I think humans are pretty amazing. And I think again, just painting very broad brushes, I think like, we have proven to be as a species very, very good at kind of making scientific and technological breakthroughs. I think the challenge that we have is as we scale doing that, I think we are hitting institutional barriers that threaten to perfectly offset or worse the advances that we're making. So yeah, one of my big worries, something I've written about a lot, but also one of my big motivators for building in Entrepreneur First, a new kind of institution, is that I do think that over the last sort of 75 years or so, we have, I think, largely accidentally done a great deal to disincentivize risk-taking by, actually in most areas of life, but I think, society feels the pain of that particularly acutely in science and technology.
Gotcha. So maybe it's something like you've got, we can build new technology. It's not like we've lost all the low-hanging fruit. We've kind of picked all the fruit because
Absolutely.
There's the pandemic's kind of a gun to our head and we're like, okay, we can figure something out if need be. What do you think is the big institutional problem? Is it, capital? Is it the motivation side? Do people not have enough slack? Has it just gotten hyper-mimetic because of social media? What do you see, being on the ground at Entrepreneur First and seeing a bunch of entrepreneurs and shepherding them through? What do you see as the big bottleneck right now?
Yeah, I think the answer to that, I think there's two parts of the answer. I think the first part is around macro talent allocation. I'll explain what I mean by that. The second, I think, is that we need new kinds of institutions that are able to better manage directed risk taking. And again, I'll explain what I mean by that. But I think the first bottleneck, macro talent allocation, I think one of the great achievements of humanity over the last couple of centuries is that it is now possible to live for many or even most people in kind of rich countries to live really comfortable, actually broadly fulfilling lives without taking any risk. And that's great in a lot of ways. I think that's a huge achievement as a species. But what it means is that nearly, in nearly all countries in the West, the default talent paths, and that's a phrase I use to mean what is the sort of most obvious path for the most talented people in a society to follow? What's the path of least resistance? That path in most of the West has become, I would argue, dominated by activities that I'm going to be rude. I think a borderline rent seeking in how they in how they capture value. Let's be really concrete. I think it would be good for the UK, where I live, if a much smaller proportion of the most talented and ambitious people went into finance. Yeah, I do think that would be good for the UK. And I think financial services is a really important part of the economy. And, I certainly don't think it should be zero, but it's kind of absurd, I think, that, I don't know what the numbers are today, but, there's certainly a time when in the last decade where if you take the top universities in the UK, 60% plus of their computer science graduates even were going into finance. I look at that and I say, well, there are kind of pretty good structural reasons to think that the market is distorted enough that a lot of the financial rewards from going into that sector don't necessarily reflect massive amounts of value creation for society as a whole. So I think one bottleneck, why is Silicon Valley so successful? I think one simple answer is it's the one place in the world where all the most talented and ambitious people want to build things, want to build primarily companies. I think building a society where the most ambitious and talented people want to build things, products that are valued by other people, is a really important thing. And you can get rent-seeking entrepreneurs, obviously, but broadly, call me a sort of starry-eyed idealist. I think most entrepreneurs are actually the vast majority of their efforts are about value creation. So I think that's one big thing, is just that, all sorts of reasons for this, but most of the world just doesn't doesn't allocate the most talented, ambitious people to the most important problems. And to be clear, I'm a pretty ardent capitalist. I'm not saying that like someone should sit in government and kind of do that allocation, but I do think we need to think hard about like what are the ways in which we may have distorted the incentives around that. So that's one thing. And then on the institutional side, I think the other bottleneck is that I'm going to slightly do an EF pitch here, but I think it's because I genuinely believe that this is a huge problem. Is that most of the institutions that we've created for funding innovation are sort of designed to retrofit examples of things that have worked in the past that actually come from a period where arguably the supply of innovation was too small. And so what we ended up doing is building a set of institutions, and thinking particularly of traditional venture capital, that sort of look like they're, kind of building on the best practice of decades of how to fund innovation, which they are. I mean, obviously, I guess in some ways I am a VC, but I think the key point here is that so much of venture capital conventional wisdom is basically built on this tiny data set of things that worked in a particular tiny corner of California for a very small segment of human history, and yet these things often get cast as like iron laws of what works and what doesn't. To give a very concrete example, which obviously I've spent the last 10 years trying to reverse, the conventional wisdom in venture capital is you should, if you're going to start a company, start with a co-founder who you've known for like a decade. Ideally, you've worked with before, maybe you went to school with, like the longer the better. That's fine, but if that were literally true, that was the only way to build great companies, then obviously we should do that. But I think it only takes a moment of thought to think about how much that limits the supply of great companies, because how many people have such a person that not only meets the kind of classic things of like, are they really smart? Are they really skilled? Are they really determined? Are they really ambitious? But also happens to have had resided in your social network for the right amount of time and wants to start a company right now. You are literally reducing by orders of magnitude the pool of potential founders. So for me, like the bottleneck that EF takes away, and it's not just EF, there are people who've sort of copied and adapted the model, but I do think removing that as a really concrete example of a bottleneck that reduces the supply of potential innovators is a really, I think, good example of how, because most institutional design in our species comes from actually a very short period of history in which I think we may over universalize the lessons that have been learned.
That's really good. That's really good. It's fascinating how the stories we tell about how these things happen, perpetuate, into the future. You said some really interesting things there, Matt, about how, the incentives for very ambitious people, we'll just take the UK as an example. They all drive to finance, high consulting, et cetera. You were at McKinsey, correct? With your co-founder, right? Yeah.
I was that guy. We were those people. Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool. It may be difficult to reflect here, but I know you went to Oxbridge, I believe, went to MIT as a Kennedy Scholar, political science. Went to consulting. You met Alice somewhere along the way at McKinsey. How did you guys decide? So you came up with this idea. How sure were you when you jumped that this was going to work? I always like to look back. Were you confident, or were you not really confident? Like did you assign odds? I don't know.
I mean, the true answer is I think we walked into it without really even properly interrogating that question. I mean, I think for us it was, it was in some ways a very stupid business to start age 25 with like no experience of entrepreneurship or venture investing or tech, right? I think we were wrong about nearly everything at EF, apart from this one central bet that turned out to be right enough that it swamped everything else, which was betting that the pool of great founders was bigger than it appeared and that you could back people pre-company. But in terms of did we think that specifically would work, I don't think we even interrogated that assumption. I think we sort of, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think there is a lot in the idea that naivety can be a real strength if it turns out that the conventional wisdom of the industry that you're entering is in some way sclerotic and, doesn't necessarily reflect, like the efficient frontier of what's possible. And so for us, like, I think if we'd actually properly asked that question, we would have not done it. In that there would have been very little good evidence supporting the what we now at EF we would call the hunch, and that kind of naivety I think can be helpful. I mean, you can overplay that, like naivety is also unhelpful. I mean, one thing I always tell our entrepreneurs is it took us a long time to get to anything that looked like a business. I mean, today, EF, we're lucky, we built $10 billion worth of companies, being quite successful. But, it took us 4 years before we really, I think, could even vaguely say like, maybe this is a thing. So I think, one advantage of starting young is, like we were 29 at that point. We still felt quite young. I think if we'd started when we were 35, we'd have been like, this it feels maybe like we're wasting a lot of time.
Yeah. Gotcha. So should people on the margin, and this is, I don't know, it's hard to give, it's very hard to give general advice. So I'll keep that in mind. But on the margin, should people stick with things more if you're smart and if you've, think you've got a good hunch?
I don't know is the answer. I don't know if you should stick with things more. I think what you should do is, I would split it into two parts. So I see people make what I believe are two different kinds of mistakes when confronting this sort of question. So one, I think people vastly undervalue the optionality inherent in trying to find out. So as in, I think that one of the underrated things about starting a company is that you will, for very low cost, learn whether something might work. And if it does work, that is so enormously valuable that it was definitely worth paying the cost that it might not. It's such an asymmetric bet. And I hear so many people who I think could be great founders agonize, almost get to this like analysis paralysis around one, whether they're ready, and two, whether or not the idea is good. And the answer is like both your abilities as a founder and the quality of the idea are much closer to being like procedurally generated by the act of getting started than they are like these things that you can analyze ex ante. And so like, I think people massively undervalue the value of finding out. So that's the first thing. Like, it's less about sticking and it's more like, try a tool. That said, I think the second thing people do is the bit where it doesn't make any sense to like stick at something is if you should be thinking in bets. You should be creating experiments for yourself where you can evaluate along the way, what is the positive signal I would expect to see if this was going to be a thing? And now for EF, that was long and painful. It took us, for example, 10 years from founding, not 10 years from investing in this, but 10 years from founding to build our first $1 billion company. And even then I'm like, is that really proof that it's working? You can always second guess whether you've really got proof. But I think what you can usually tell yourself about any given experiment in an entrepreneurial context is, what is the signal I would expect to see now if this was going to be actually a big success 10 years from now? And so for us at EF, like the reason we kept going, and there were, we left our jobs in September, and I can easily imagine a world where we'd quit by January. But what we did, which I think was good, like one of the few really good decisions we made in that first year, was rather than give ourselves loads of time to recruit the first cohort, we set the deadline to be New Year's Eve of that year. So we had like 3.5, 4 months. And you know what? Like, we got hundreds of applicants, and a lot of them were terrible. But there was like a real hardcore group of, like 70, 80 applicants. We were like, these people look really interesting, exceptional people. And so like, we had no, to be clear, and to emphasize the point in like how people should stick or not stick to something, we had no proof that the methodology or the thesis were going to work. Like, cool, you could put these people in a room and nothing might happen. But for the stage that we were at, you know, like in the bet we were making, that was a positive signal. And so like, I think it buys you a bit of almost like a willpower boost to then like observe the next set of outcomes. And, you know, actually that took a bit longer, you know, like then it wasn't until the following September that we really got to observe whether these people would build companies, and then, you know, another 6 months before we know whether anyone would fund them. And so, you know, like, I think you're just constantly running at a moving target. But the thing you need to be honest to yourself about is like, is this where you would want to be given the goal that you're getting, you know, kind of say you're aiming for the long run?
That's super helpful. That's super helpful. So it's like it's a moving target, but you need to keep it kind of your eye on a ball, like in the future, and you're trying to meet these goals and getting feedback, and it's kind of a more procedural thing than just like, you know.
The one thing I just emphasize on that, just to tie the two halves of my question together, is the nice thing about that is that if you're honest with yourself, and actually after 3 months or whatever, if we hadn't got those applications, hey, it's cost you 3 months. Like the important part, it almost feels like sticking is winning, and like dropping is losing. Not at all. Like this is what I mean about the option value, right? I mean, it's so asymmetric. If it turned out not to work, like, don't feel guilty about it. Great, you learned something. Move on. Like, I think if more people took that approach, we'd also increase the supply of people actually trying to do new and interesting things, and I think that's important.
That's super interesting. I want to do this for EF. So I ran this calculation for something I was writing for Eric recently about, you know, the expected value of getting into Y Combinator. It was something like $25 million. And that's like, it's like double the value of a Harvard MBA. And I'm sure EF would be something like very impressive like that, where it's like the expected value is actually like really high to like go through a program like this, even though, you know, they're like kind of tail weighted at times. Yeah. Do you think like people are just bad at assessing, like taking those small bets? Like, you know, you guys like were rational about it. It's like, well, you know, 3 months we can go back, we do something else. If it doesn't work, that's fine. But the upside is massive. It's, you know, billions of dollars of value created for the world. Do you think, are people just bad at assessing risk, and are they just too kind of focused on avoiding the downside, if that makes sense?
This is a great question. I would say two things, both of which are slightly avoiding the question. So feel free to press me if at the end of it feels like I haven't answered.
Might be a bad question.
No, it's not a bad question. I think, so my first answer would be, I don't think most people even get to the stage of making that calculation. And that I think making that decision is downstream of a lot of cultural norms that most places don't have. I actually find that if we get candidates to that stage, actually they usually do make the right, I'm biased, like the right call, as in they usually do say like, yeah, the expected value of this is high, it's totally asymmetric, like, you know, worst case, I'm going to meet a community of people who I'm probably going to be friends. You know, we don't have a lot of problems with people like getting to the point of running the calculation and then being like, oh, I'm putting so much weight on the downside. Which, to be clear, I don't think it's absurd that they might. There probably are some cultures where that would be more likely, but I think getting to the point of making the calculation, there's like a legibility thing. Like, is this even an option that I can put a shape around? That's a big deal. And then there's a sort of broader sort of cultural issue around just what's legitimate. You know, one sort of like anecdote that maybe illustrates this is when we actually in both London and then when we opened up in Singapore, we found that one of the key stakeholder groups that we just had completely not thought about was parents. So we target generally, or we did at the time, young people, you know, like people literally coming out of university or in the first couple of years. These days a bit more flex on that, but like, and you know, one thing that was non-obvious was that, or to me at least, was that if their parents thought this was legitimate and or even prestigious, then it was then that totally changed the calculation. But you know, you could say, oh well, surely great founders don't care about what their parents think. I think this is sort of this weird, very Silicon Valley centric reasoning where it's like, people are like wildly impacted by context. Like, you know, it's the classic, like, what is the water you're swimming in that you can't see? And I think like, I think it's a really dangerous idea for society to sort of imbibe that entrepreneurs are these like completely, against the grain weirdos and misfits, who just like, they don't need any sort of like social validation in order to do it. I actually think that's not true at all. In fact, I think the history of that Silicon Valley is the opposite. It's creating a context where it's normalized so that people don't even have to make that calculation. And so like in both the UK and in Singapore, we sort of deliberately hacked the process by partnering with organizations that carried prestige, even though they were completely irrelevant to what we were actually doing. So, the first kickoff event we did for the first London cohort, we did at 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's official residence in London. Like, was there any relevance to that? No, not at all. But they all got a picture outside the front door and they all sent it to their parents, and every single one of these people signed up to join the program. And so I think we just generally still underrate the power of culture and like a lot of the way that people make these decisions is just downstream of that in like very deep ways that mean they never even get to the calculation.
Man, that's really good. That reminds me, Brian Armstrong tells the story where he was, working at Airbnb, he kept applying to an accelerator. He might have been Y Combinator, I'm not sure. Yeah, and until he got in, he couldn't explain to his parents why he wanted to leave and start Coinbase.
Absolutely. One thing that I think is really fascinating about so many amazing founders is that when you dig into their stories, there's so often a point where they are so far outside the like classic mythologized version of a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk story. There's often a moment where you're like, if you met this person at this point, you would think they were just like either a wannabe or a loser, and I don't mean like about their talent. I just mean that there is this, I do think it's so like pernicious, the myth that like the great founders just had everything figured out from the start and were always these ultra sophisticated people. Like sophistication, all these things, these are like cultural attributes that are like learned and inherited and imitated. And like, one of our biggest company, Tractable at EF, I really distinctly remember the founder, I don't think he'd mind me saying this, replying to an email from a VC when he was graduating from EF. And, he was like brand new to startups, and the guy was like, can you send me a deck? And instead of coming to ask someone at EF what that meant, he was just like, what's a deck? That's what he put in his thing. Like, this is a guy that runs $1 billion business. And like, you could take that snapshot and be like, this person, is X or Y. And the reality is like, entrepreneurs, in my experience, are just very talented people who would be successful at nearly anything they did. And therefore redirecting this talent to entrepreneurship is really high value.
That's so good. That's been one of the more surprising things about running this podcast. You talk to people like Vitalik Buterin, and just the list goes on, and you just realize they're people. I mean, they're not. There's not some halo that they're very smart, very talented, but at the end of the day, they are just people.
Yeah, and if I can labor the point just for another 1 minute, I'm very passionate about this. Like, I really believe that very few people have really bothered to look at the data on what makes great entrepreneurs. And so, like, there are so many myths, and there's so much, like, totally bizarre analysis, often by VCs who I think would completely reject this quality of analysis if it were about anything else, but they select entirely on the dependent variable and say like, oh, well, great founders have these characteristics. And it's like, well, what, relative to what population? Like, like there's all this stuff. But like the number one thing that I take from reading the literature, and, I don't want to pretend I've been like ultra comprehensive in it, but like the most surprising thing I've come across in the literature around entrepreneurship is that whenever you get a quasi-natural experiment that means that people who wouldn't normally be entrepreneurs but are very high skill become entrepreneurs somewhat involuntarily. A great example is, for example, in the UK and US in periods where banks hire fewer people, like exogenously, because there's a downturn. Not only do more people become entrepreneurs, somewhat predictable, but I think the conventional wisdom, like from VC land, would be, well, these people weren't passionate about entrepreneurship, right? Otherwise, they'd have done it already. These are people who are like enforced to do it, so they're probably less good. No, like on average, those people do better than people who choose to be entrepreneurs in normal times. Why? Basically because they're disproportionately high skill individuals. And the reality is, again, with the possible exception of Silicon Valley, in most places around the world, again, I don't mean this in a rude way, but like, you could increase the average caliber of entrepreneurs in terms of just raw smarts and capability by transferring from whatever is the most prestigious career path in that place into entrepreneurship. I think conventionally you're like, yeah, but they won't be true founders. That's just a complete, kind of made up concept. It's not a real thing. Like, all the evidence is involuntary entrepreneurs that come from high skill professions do better than average entrepreneurs. And I find that like an incredibly liberating fact for humanity, that we can actually just allocate more talent to this space and you will get better outcomes.
That is super, it's a very encouraging statement. That is very encouraging, because there is a story, like you said, where it's like, well, it's like it's not just the skill component. There's these other weird things. You have to have like all these interesting insights, and it's like very, you have to know someone for a long time, and you can't engineer this. But in reality, a lot of what you can do is you can take high skilled people, if you redirect them in the right way, and they can be successful in building kind of breakout companies at the end of the day.
I totally believe that. That is, well, I've spent a long time betting on that, but I think the evidence is actually relatively clear on it.
That's great. That's super interesting. I'm curious. I want to talk a little bit about EF and this idea of co-founder matching, which is something you guys really did pioneer. No one thought this was possible before you did it. Are there, I don't, you don't have to give the special sauce away, but I'm curious. It does seem like it is a difficult problem to match people together well, because these foundings they are really important. And how do you match people together well? Do you encourage people just to, break up quickly? Do you encourage people to, search, in a wider space? How do you get people to find good co-founders?
Yeah, well, I think you sort of touched on it. I think, again, it goes back to this thing where I think when people start to think about this problem, they tend to think about it in an overly analytical way. So like, let's say there's an EF cohort of 50 people. I think, left to their own devices, most people, and I think this makes a ton of sense why they would think breadth first, right? I'm going to meet everyone in the group, and then I'm going to like stack rank them in some way against some sort of criteria, and then I'm going to sort of like work with the person that's top of my list. That was our intuition too. We spent a lot of time in the first few years trying to make that work. And lots of other things work, like personality testing, like all sorts of like companies' approaches that had a formula, blah, blah, blah. We found that literally none of these things work. And again, I think that the quality of your co-founding relationship, again, is like somewhat procedurally generated. In other words, you only can find that out by actually working with someone. Alice and I have a whole book about this coming out in September, by the way, How to Be a Founder. But it's not out yet, so I'm not plugging it. But basically, what we say in the book and what we've practiced for the last decade at EF is that you just need to invert the social norms that exist in the real world, quote unquote. So in the real world, if you and I, were considering starting a company together, the bar for us deciding to do that would be really high. And the reason it'd be really high is primarily because once we decided to do it, the bar to decide to get out of it would also be really high. It would be super embarrassing. Like, it would be embarrassing to have the conversation, you and I, but it'd also be embarrassing to tell our friends, like, oh, how's it going with Will? Oh, actually, we stopped working. Just there's all these like small, but like en masse, like extremely powerful incentives to make it hard to test a co-founder relationship. So what EF does systematically is it just inverts those two things. It makes the bar to getting into a team really low, precisely because we engineer a sort of like artificial social norm that there is going to be no awkwardness whatsoever when we get out of a team. And it turns out that if you do that, and you have to really lean into it, by the way, you can't just say, by the way, guys, don't be awkward about getting out of a team. I mean, like, we go to great lengths. Like, every time you form a team, you have to sort of like, I say, register it. You click a button on the platform, and then when you get out of a team, you click the button again. That will be sent to a Slack channel that everyone sees that's like, Will and Matt have got into a team, and then Will and Matt have broken up. And if you break up and it goes on the Slack channel, you have to like write a comment and celebrate the breakup, explain what you learned, and then everyone piles in and like congratulates you on breaking up. Why are they congratulating you? One, you learned something about what you need in a co-founder and what it's going to make work, take for you to find a really productive partnership. And two, without sounding too sort of like mechanical about it, you've added liquidity back into the pool. Like if people want to stay velocity really matters in a fixed size community. Like you want to make the time spent in bad teams really, really, really short. So there is a little bit more to it than that. And obviously like we've built a set of tools and methods and again, norms that facilitate this. But broadly, we try and approach it from a position of extreme intellectual humility. I have no idea who you should co-found with, and nor do you until you try. Now, as it happens, almost all the good teams at EF form in the first few weeks. So we give people 3 months. Actually, we've cut it a bit, but we give people quite a long time. But the vast majority of teams form in the first 2 weeks. But the average person we fund 3 months later, so or rather the average company we fund, the founders have been through about 2.5 pairings, on average, before they found the right person. And I do think that although there's a bunch of our teams that were first, the first person they met, it worked. The people where that's not true, they will at least tell you that there was a huge amount that they learned about what they were looking for through the failed partnerships.
Gotcha. I love that. And do you have a sense of, seeing so many cohorts of what works in a co-founding relationship? Is it kind of like a technical pairing and a more, business side, sales, marketing pairing? Or is there just really no formula and it is just people need to try it?
You definitely need complementary skills, for sure. Now, depending on the kind of company, that could dictate very different pairings. Like sometimes it makes sense to have 2 people with really deep technical skills as the 2 co-founders. Sometimes you do want someone with, I hesitate to say like the business guy, but you want a person where she has sold things before, or he has worked in the domain that you're trying to sell to before, or whatever. Like that makes a lot of sense. But that is really contingent on the idea. What I would say is what we do know is the way you measure that is just by productivity. So one of the challenges of investing this early. We invest in companies 3 months after the founders met at most. And sometimes it's 6 weeks. What you can measure, even if the idea is not even set, is how productive is this team together? And, I hesitate to say anything universal about entrepreneurship because there are so many exceptions, but it is really tough for me to think of a really good company that we have funded that wasn't really productive as soon as they started working together. And the converse is also true. I don't think that teams that are super productive, it's very rare. If you really genuinely are just getting so much done as a pairing, it's so unlikely that you don't figure something out. Doesn't mean you're going to be a billionaire, but productivity is this core metric at EF.
Does that look like just kind of output, work product, whatever that looks like, whatever the product is, they have produced a lot of impressive things in a short amount of time?
Yeah, I think over the years we've measured this in lots of different ways at EF, and I think we've got better at it. But the heuristic I give people that you can implement very easily yourself is this. It's so obvious to the point of being banal, but I think it's worth doing systematically, which is decide what an ambitious goal would be for a week. As in, what would actually be if I'm working at my peak, we could get this done together. Write it down, revisit in a week. Did you do it? Now, what I think is interesting is, one, the best teams are consistently, let's say at least 3 weeks in 4, they're hitting an ambitious goal. They're the good teams. The best teams also are creating what I would call positive surprise. It's we genuinely were stretching ourselves in setting that goal, but then this other thing happened and we did this and it was actually great. And, I think for me, if I could only know one thing about a team, it would be how many positive surprises do they generate per week on average? And I don't care what they're working on. That would, we have a $500 million company in the portfolio that was just running in completely the wrong direction for the entirety of EF. but were wildly productive in doing so. And it took them, another year post-EF to figure out the right direction. But I would always bet on the productivity. That's how I think about it.
So founders should focus on shipping, being productive as possible. Like it really is like that. That's a good metric.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Do people come to you with ideas, or do they co-found and like find their co-founder and like come up with an idea? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a funny thing in that, like, obviously it doesn't work if no one has ideas.
Right.
We found that it's pretty tough to like start with a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah.
So, I think we've often struggled to phrase and frame this for entrepreneurs. Like, we're not anti-idea. Like, actually, we love it when people apply with ideas. It's just that we're not going to take the idea into account in deciding whether to admit it. So, like, I would say probably 70% of people join with ideas, of which half are terrible. And if we had used it as a filter, we wouldn't have admitted them. And so, like, what we ask people to do is, like, we don't tell people what to work on. You can work on whatever you want. But we think most people should be open-minded about whether their idea might not be improved by working with someone else. So we take people with ideas, we take people without ideas, but the point is that we are, at the point of admission, completely agnostic about that. We don't think at that stage that it is a helpful proxy for the quality of the entrepreneur.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Matt, I'm curious. Can you talk a little bit about the history of ambition? You've written a little bit about this. You've done some really good podcasts on this. What does the history of ambition look like, and why is it important?
Yeah, well, it sort of touches on one of the themes we've already discussed, which is this idea of there being default paths for ambitious people, which could be more or less valuable for the world. So, the way I think about ambition is like ambition is the search for impact, and it's the search crucially for leverage. So in the absence of social and other technologies, most of us can't have a lot of impact outside our immediate person. And, there's nothing wrong with that. But ambitious people, almost by definition, are sort of thinking, how do I, simply by my own actions, find levers that just magnify and amplify that impact into the world? And so the history of ambition is a search for like those levers and finding the most effective levers that there are. Now, obviously, what those levers are is both culturally and technologically determined. And so, like my argument that I've made is, a lot of the entrepreneurs of today, if they were alive 1,000 years ago, they wouldn't be entrepreneurs because there weren't the social and cultural and technical technologies that gave leverage. Instead, most of them would be probably priests. I'm talking in a Western Europe sense, which obviously where I grew up. Why? Not because they were particularly religious. In fact, probably wouldn't be, but just that the church was a path to literacy and to scale through, the sort of parish and, episcopal system. And that gave some people, not very many, but like the most talented and ambitious, a genuine path to achieve real scale. And it was kind of the only path really for people that were born, not into wealthy families already. And, English history in the medieval and early modern period is full of these kind of amazing stories of people who came from absolutely nothing, climbed the church hierarchy and became very powerful. The example I've talked about most is a guy called Thomas Wolsey, who became Cardinal Wolsey and built one of the grandest houses, Hampton Court, in England. But I think the point that I have tried to make to people is that over time those those levers change. So at various points, arguably, military service was, one of the biggest levers for ambitious people. I think one of the interesting things about the 20th century is that you started to get like a much more formalized set of mechanisms around how ambitious people could amplify their impact around organizations. So like by the time you get to the 20th century, one of the like obvious ways to seek leverage is run a big company and tell those people below you what to do, who'll tell people, bureaucracy was an incredible invention in the history of ambition. And I think the thing that I would emphasize is that every time you get a sort of social technology change, you usually also get an institutional change to train people for that new social technology. So, I won't labor the point, it's probably quite obvious to people, but, like with the rise of literacy, you get a whole set of innovations around what schools are and what universities are, military school, business school, etc. And so you can probably see where this is going, that my big claim is, to me, it's very obvious in the 21st century, by far the most powerful technology of ambition is software, services that can be delivered over an internet connection, and all the sort of like adjacent things to that. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. Scale is built in. If it can be delivered over an internet connection, you can literally reach billions of people. Cost is very low. The fact that it's so cheap to get started in tech, at least again, sort of taking a sort of Western perspective, means that the relative power of capital compared to talent is low. I always say the sort of like tagline is, from writing checks to writing code, is a big shift towards individual talent in my view. And scope, there's almost nothing you can't attack through digital technologies. And so, my argument is that it kind of seems obvious to me that with the rise of that technology of ambition, we're going to see the demand for entrepreneurship increase by orders of magnitude. There'll be orders of magnitude more people that want to be technology entrepreneurs, say 30 years from now than 30 years ago. And so the question is, what are the institutions that we need that can have a comparable impact on that field that the university or the school did on literacy? Obviously, I hope and believe that Entrepreneur First will be one of them, and in particular because I think by taking our unit of interest as the individual rather than the company, there's a real opportunity to create that legibility and that legitimacy that we talked about earlier, but also start to actually shift the culture and, with some irony, I suppose, become a badge, a legitimation of that career path that enables lots more people to have a lot more impact.
That's great. That's great. Do you think as a piece of technology that founders and individuals can use for leverage, do you think the internet is becoming mature? Are we still early? Where's your sense of where we are in that cycle? When I think to the really, really big companies, it feels like the Googles, the Facebooks, those were Amazons. Those were built the early 2000s, the 10s. The Ubers and the Airbnbs. They're a little bit smaller. So is there a sense like some of the fruit's been picked, or do you think it's just like perhaps that's kind of a lagging indicator?
It's a great question, and sort of much debated. I suspect my strong belief is the answer is we're just getting started. I think I very much. I don't know if you've seen or your listeners have seen the essay by Ben Thompson on this topic, where he talks about. Effectively, a lot of the platforms we have today are natural endpoints for, kind of in the history of computing, everywhere. And, we can compute everywhere today and, kind of on a handheld device. And, if you just sort of look at the chain of companies that were disrupted, it's less obvious today how much further you could go on these dimensions. So that I sort of buy. But, to try and bring it to life, I think thinking of, for example, biology as an information problem, we're at the tiniest, we're a speck on the chart of how far there is to go on that. I suspect the same is going to end up being true for energy. I suspect there is a Google scale company that is not Google to be still built in AI. I just think that the other way, other than Ben Thompson's way of thinking about it, is what are the, how do you think about the possibilities of combinatorial innovation with the building blocks we've got? And it feels like we've taken that a long way, but actually I think we've sort of remained very much in our silos. Google is an internet company. It's doing a lot of other stuff, but it's certainly not a biology as an information problem company. And I suspect there's $1 trillion company or several $1 trillion companies in that, for example.
Gotcha. So still a lot of low-hanging fruit to be
There's a lot to do. I don't know if it's low-hanging. I think these are hard businesses to build, but I think there is a lot of fruit to pick.
That's great. I've got kind of two last questions here. First one is, you gave a great talk. It may have been at one of the EA Globals, maybe it was more the local conferences in Oxford, about how EA should think about using the internet for scale and founding companies as a good career path. Do you still think that's true? Do you think EA should, on the margin, think more about building great companies as a way to be effective, an effective altruist in the world?
Yeah, I do. And I guess I think there are two different arguments that could get you there. One is just that it's quite if as a community EAs decide that that's good, and I think there's a lot of people that believe that anyway within the EA movement. The nice thing is that you have even more downside protection from the normal concern, the sort of normal. I guess normally I would argue, hey, it's such an asymmetric bet that it's worth taking. If you're an EA and like a large chunk of the cohort of entrepreneurs are also EA, you should feel really good about that because, maybe you'll be the next Sam Bankman-Fried, but if not, hopefully it's someone else in your cohort. And actually, like in that sense, if what you really care about, is just like what happens to the proceeds of your gains, like the more EAs that get into this space, if you believe what I say, it's like actually largely a talent game rather than do you have the entrepreneur gene, then it sort of seems like the expected value is really high, and the more EAs that are doing it, the more likely that when you pick from the distribution, it's an EA that makes it really big and can do the next future fund or whatever. So I think that's one argument. I think the other argument, though, which is like not an earning to give argument, is I just do think that if you can find things that work at unit scale and are positive and then do them billions of times, that is an underrated, way to have positive impact in the world. And, I'm going to say something very facetious, but it's like not insane, which is, you could argue that one of the most EA companies you could build would be just a better dating app. I think there's a lot of evidence that, matching really matters for lifetime satisfaction, and there's lots of positive spillover effects from that. And, I think the market for finding your match is, still probably, I'm not suggesting people go out and build a dating app, but it's just an example of like, I think you could have even just a lot of counterfactual impact in a sort of like pro-EA way by building something that just has a ton of consumer surplus. I think there's obviously better examples that are like, how do you scale like more conventional positive impact? But I'm a big fan of consumer surplus at scale. I think it's like one of the most important things there is.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned this earlier. Most founders, are especially founders that kind of go through EF. They're not building rent-sinking companies. They are building companies that are providing, some deflationary value to the world, which is super cool. Well, Matt, my last question here. You just raised a massive round in a downturn, no less. Which congratulations to that.
Thank you
for y'all on executing on it. It's super cool. It's a great sign of y'all, everything you guys have built. It's really inspiring. What's next for EF? What does the next 50 years look like?
Yeah, well, you're right. It's a very exciting time at EF. So, we just raised $158 million from a coalition of, I think in my view, some of the world's best founders, people like John and Patrick Collison, Reid Hoffman, Matt Mullenweg, many, many others. And we structured this, I'm not going to be too boring and technical, but we structured this in I think a pretty interesting way in that this is not a fund. It's an investment into our company. The goal is to be a permanent capital vehicle. And one of the reasons it's really exciting to structure like that is that it allows us to think and behave like an operating company rather than a fund. And the reason I emphasize that is I think one of the limitations of funds, although they make so much sense for most VCs, is that they're kind of a single product. Like, you basically swapping cash for equity at a price determined by the market. And some people are really good at that, and that's amazing. But what is quite hard to do in a fund model is to go back to your LPs, your investors, and say, hey, I know we've been making you a ton of money doing X for the last 10 years, but now we're going to try do Y. LPs don't like that, and rightly so. Like, LPs have to be more conservative than like individual angel investors. They're investing, like, for example, pensioners' money or whatever. What's nice about being a company is that you create complete long-term permanent alignment between my analysis interests and the interests of every investor, which includes, by the way, some really big institutions, including some pension funds. But what we're able to say is, look, we've made a ton of money for our investors over the last decade by doing product A, but we believe we are touching just a tiny fraction of the, kind of space of great founders that the world's missing out on. Like today, EF has one product and it works incredibly well for people in the first 8 years of their career who want to start a company right now and need a co-founder. That's great. As I said, done about $10 billion of value through that one product. Feel good about that. But, what about second-time founders? What about people with 15 years of experience or people who don't want or can't make a 3-month full-time quit your job commitment right now? Once you start to think about like the space of founders that the world's missing out on, you start to think like, wow, this EF needs to be a multi-product company. And yeah, like we're going to continue doing what we're doing. We're not abandoning this product. We love it. We think it's had a ton of impact. But I think what you can expect to see from EF, even in the short term, even in the next sort of 12 months, is a lot of experimentation around the product offering for different kinds of founders globally. And I think if we do that right, then, to answer your question over the 50-year horizon, I think the way I see it is we want EF to be, the obvious place for any entrepreneur to find their co-founder. And we want to have a product that fits, every entrepreneur, in every sector, in every part of the world. And I think that one of my big reflections in general is that founders probably underrate longevity in build. Like if you care about impact, then something that goes on for a very long time, almost by definition, eventually has more impact than stuff that doesn't. I think our goal is increasingly to think about what does it take to make sure that EF outlives us? What does it take to to be self-funding, not to ever need to raise external capital, but also to be why do universities last for like thousands of years when companies normally die? I think largely because they're incredible platforms for talent that have been very flexible in the product that they offer, but have kept very fixed the idea of being a springboard or amplifier for individual talent. I don't think we want to be a university. That's not anywhere close to our goals. We're all about building companies that otherwise wouldn't exist. But when you start to think about like being a platform for talent, like aiming to be a meaningful part of the life story of some of the most impactful people of this century, I think it's something I can imagine spending the next 50 years working on.
Man, I love that vision. I really love that vision. That's so cool. I wish you guys the best of luck. I can't wait to see what comes down the pike. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you? Where should we send people if they're interested in EF?
Awesome. Yeah. Well, you can find EF at joinef.com, joinef.com. And you can find me probably best on Twitter at Matthew Clifford, where I tweet a lot about EF, but also about some of the other things that we've been talking about as well.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thank you.